welcome to the debate. Our focus today is on, well, one of the most consequential economic upheavals of the modern era, the catastrophic financial transformation of Russia following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991.
Exactly. And this period, the economic trauma often called katastroika, it led into the decade known as the Likhye 90, the wild 90s. And this time was defined by just a massive, fraudulent transfer of state wealth. The public even coined a term for it, Piratisation.
Right, and this era wasn't just about moving money around. It fundamentally established the structure of Russia's current, crony capitalism. And it laid the groundwork for deep structural problems, things like the demographic dip that's actually fueling current labor shortages.
So the central question we're digging into today is about the primary origin of this whole disaster. Was the failure of Russia's 1990s transition mainly down to the structural flaws and the, let's say, political haste embedded in the shock therapy policy design itself? The whole speed over quality thing? Or, as the other side might argue, was the determining factor the truly unprecedented, endemic financial crime, and frankly, fraudulent execution that defined privatization? Things like the rigged auctions, the massive capital flight.
Okay, and for our discussion today, I'll be arguing that the fatal flaws were inherent in that policy design, driven by the political needs of the reformers at the time. And I'll argue that while, yes, the initial policy was rushed, maybe flawed, the economic collapse and the sheer scale of the wealth transfer that followed were really driven by deliberate, sophisticated financial crime and, importantly, international complicity. It's a failure of execution and a major case study, I think, for the financial crime and AML world.
Okay, so my core claim is that the catastrophe was almost structurally guaranteed by the reform process itself. It explicitly put urgent political goals ahead of, economic stability and building sound institutions. The architects of shock therapy, Yegor Gaidar, Anatoly Chubais, they were laser-focused on basically one thing: creating a new class of private property owners so fast that a communist return would be politically impossible.
Right.
The source material makes it pretty clear they believe the speed of privatization was much more important than the quality of this process. And this priority, it created instant structural failure. Take the first phase, voucher privatization. It was essentially a massive giveaway. They put an almost impossibly low value on all state property. Just, $5 to $10 billion?
Yeah, an incredibly low number.
Exactly. And couple that with the hyperinflation that hit almost immediately, a staggering 2,520% inflation in 1992. It just decimated the Russian economy. Ordinary people, their life savings gone overnight, had no choice but to sell their 10,000 ruble vouchers for, practically nothing. The phrase was often, for a bottle of vodka. This setup basically guaranteed that the vast majority of assets fell straight into the hands of factory insiders, the so-called red directors, right from the very beginning. The policy design, I argue, willingly accepted corruption as sort of necessary collateral damage to achieve the main political goal: defeat communism.
Okay, I absolutely acknowledge the political pressures and, yes, the devastating immediate impact of the voucher system and that hyperinflation. But my analysis really suggests that the unprecedented scale of wealth transfer and inequality that came next was driven by a true execution failure. A failure defined by deliberate, sophisticated financial crime and, crucially, a lack of global enforcement. While the vouchers were flawed, sure, the truly egregious privatization happened a bit later, didn't it? Between 95 and 96, during the loans for shares scheme, that's when the nation's strategic assets, the crown jewels like oil, gas, metals, were transferred. This scheme was famously described as a fraudulent shambles. The whole procedure was rigged. Oligarchs' own banks were actually designated as the auctioneers for assets they themselves were bidding on.
Right. A clear conflict.
A massive conflict. It allowed them to acquire incredibly valuable companies. We see examples like Yukos, estimated to be worth maybe $5 billion, acquired for just $310 million. Now, this wasn't some unforeseen policy mistake or collateral effect. It was, as the data really confirms, a crude trade of property for political support. And critically, this newly acquired wealth wasn't reinvested. It was immediately stripped and laundered abroad. This drove a historic, sustained capital outflow. The estimates are around $800 billion since 1990. And this required sophisticated financial crime mechanisms. For instance, the systematic use of transfer pricing, where companies sell goods like oil to their own offshore shell entities at wildly discounted, non-market rates just to strip profits out of the country before any tax. This, to me, represents a massive execution failure, both inside Russia and internationally.
It's a very clear summary of the staggering fraud in the loans for shares deals. But I do worry that focusing only on the criminality of 95-96 kind of distracts from the institutional and social void that the initial policies created. Let me offer a slightly different perspective. Gaidar's initial shock therapy, that combination of price liberalization and uncontrolled deficit spending, it created this incredibly dangerous worst of both worlds hybrid system. It violently pulled the rug out from under central planning, yes, but without establishing the most fundamental requirement for capitalism, rule of law foundations.
Okay.
And the resulting social trauma was just immense. We mentioned hyperinflation wiping out savings, but we have to acknowledge the sheer human devastation. The economy contracted by almost 50%. And critically, that 5-year collapse in male life expectancy during the early 1990s. That mortality crisis, I think, demonstrates that the structural defects of the policy, the failure to manage the economy, to protect social stability, were already tearing the country apart. It created the exact institutional vacuum where the criminal activity you described could flourish. The system was arguably in freefall because of flawed policy before those big oligarch auctions even happened.
That social trauma and, yes, the life expectancy drop is a profound human tragedy. It really underscores the scale of the failure. However, I want to re-examine this premise that the policy simply created the void. While sure, the initial chaos definitely facilitated corruption, the subsequent economic crisis was amplified, I'd say exponentially, by the intentional exclusion of competitive bidders and the outright rigging of the most valuable auctions. The fact that a massive company like Norilsk Nickel, producing nickel and palladium, was acquired for a mere $170.1 million, just a fraction of its real worth. That demonstrates not some inevitable consequence of an institutional void, but a premeditated criminal execution failure. This collusion, which fundamentally transferred strategic national assets at fire sale prices, it guaranteed the public would see the entire process as illegitimate.
The loss of faith, I believe, stemmed directly from witnessing this blatant fraud, not from people struggling to grasp complex macroeconomic theories about deficit spending.
I'm not entirely convinced by that line of reasoning, because the architects, particularly Chubais, were actually on record saying they were willing to hand over the property without competition, without openness, for a bargain price. They did this explicitly, the sources suggest, to ensure Yeltsin's political survival against the resurgent communists in the 1996 election. So the fraud, therefore, wasn't just some unfortunate execution failure or a side effect that happened in the void. It seems it was integrated into the political strategy itself. It was considered, perhaps, necessary collateral damage for securing the main political objective. That makes it structurally endemic to the policy's implementation plan, doesn't it?
Okay, that covers the domestic political calculation, perhaps. But we absolutely must pivot now and address the critical international element, the facilitation, maybe even complicity of Western institutions. I come at this, as I mentioned, from an AML anti-money laundering perspective. The fraud wasn't purely homegrown or just justified by political necessity. The international failure of financial oversight was, I think, crucial. Look at the Harvard Institute for International Development, HIID project. It received millions from USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, supposedly to promote market transparency.
Right. I remember that.
Yeah, well, this project was compromised when its own leaders, Professor Schleifer and Jonathan Hay, were found to have used their advisory positions to actually profit from investments in Russia. It was a huge conflict of interest scandal. Harvard eventually paid a $26.5 million settlement. This shows that the ethical foundations, the international oversight meant to ensure fair reform, were deeply compromised by some of the foreign experts and advisors themselves. It blurred the lines between reform and personal gain right from the start. That's a failure of fiduciary duty, a failure of global financial integrity.
That's a very interesting point about the Hyatt scandal, and it definitely highlights a breakdown of ethical controls in the implementation, no question.
But I'd argue the ultimate structural failure was still the policy's inability to create robust property rights, which are just fundamental to any market function. The source material notes that capital fled, estimated at 15% of GDP throughout the 1990s, because, quote, only assets abroad are safe from expropriation. The policy design fundamentally failed to provide that institutional security, reliable property rights, a functional, independent judicial system that's necessary for domestic reinvestment. So capital flight was almost the compelled response to an environment where the state simply couldn't guarantee ownership security. You can't blame transnational crime entirely when the state failed to provide the basic legal architecture for capitalism to even function.
But the sheer scale and the sophistication of the capital flight mechanisms, that illustrates a fundamental failure of global financial enforcement, not just a response to weak domestic laws. We are talking about organized financial crime on a massive scale here. The reliance on transfer pricing, the fake contracts, the extensive use of jurisdictions like Cyprus, as a money laundering haven, that requires sophisticated international facilitation. And the Bank of New York, the Booney scandal, illustrates this perfectly. $7.5 billion laundered through a, quote, respectable Western financial institution. And this connected illicit funds, known Russian organized crime figures like Semyon Mogilevich, and Western finance. And get this, the husband of a key Booney employee involved had actually been Russia's IMF representative during the shock therapy period. This level of sophisticated transnational financial crime that points to a profound failure of AML enforcement, and that defined where the wealth ultimately ended up offshore and hidden, almost regardless of what domestic institutional void existed.
Okay, let's look at the enduring legacy then. Perhaps the most critical ripple effect of the 1990s policy failure is that profound loss of public faith. The widely shared disillusionment, as the material calls it, that ultimately created the political mandate for Vladimir Putin to come in and restore order. This, to me, is fundamentally a failure of policy legitimacy. Putin capitalized directly on the fact that the public saw privatization as illegitimate and associated the whole democratic process with chaos and corruption. This policy legacy, that loss of faith, is what allowed him to successfully redefine the rule of law as basically an instrument of state power, resulting in today's state capitalism. The failure to build a legitimate, fair system from the start is the structural constraint that continues to define Russia's political economy.
I'm sorry, but I just don't quite buy that the loss of faith is the sole defining legacy. The execution failure and the resulting structure of the oligarchic economy, that's what defines the current operational rules, I think. Look at the Yukos affair in 2003. Mikhail Khodorkovsky lost his assets through, over $30 billion in basically invented tax claims. That was state-orchestrated expropriation, plain and simple.
A clear example, yes.
Exactly. And that act established the shaky nature of property rights and solidified the rule that wealth in Russia is held only at the pleasure of the Kremlin. This state-level financial aggression was the ultimate outcome, I argue, of the criminal, opaque execution of the 1990s reforms. The legacy isn't just failed democracy, it's an enduring system of financial control where the state can revoke ownership based on political loyalty. It fundamentally replaced a private monopoly created by flawed execution with a state monopoly that operates with the same extractive mindset.
Well, to summarize my position, while the subsequent corruption and expropriation were indeed staggering, the initial policy itself, the rush to privatize for political ends, the arbitrary valuation, the resulting mass poverty, and that devastating demographic catastrophe, that, I believe, is the fundamental, structural reason Russia didn't transition successfully. These policy choices destroyed the institutional and, importantly, the psychological foundations needed for a functional market economy, setting the stage for the political backlash that followed.
And from my perspective, while the structural damage from the economic contraction was undeniably immense, the defining feature of the era was intentional financial crime and a glaring lack of enforcement, both domestic and international. This ranges from those initial rigged auctions that instantly created oligarchs to the systemic asset stripping and the international money laundering facilitated by global finance, like the Bonwai case. This fraudulent execution created a system of immense concentrated wealth, an explosive rise in inequality, and ultimately ensured that the profits of the transition benefited a select, often criminal few, rather than stabilizing the country as perhaps the reformers had initially hoped.
So, we've explored whether the failure of Russia's economic transition lies primarily in the flawed policy design of shock therapy or in the endemic fraud and execution failures of privatization.
Right, and both sides draw heavily on the evidence from that traumatic period in the 1990s, focusing on whether the core constraint was structural design or indeed criminal execution, particularly when you factor in the failures of global financial enforcement.
We leave it to you, the listener, to weigh the evidence presented and consider the enduring structural and financial constraints these foundational events continue to place on Russia's economic future.